Good afternoon. This is Dan Abella from PKD Talks and the Philip K. Dick Festival. Before me, we have a very special guest today. His name is Erik Davis. Erik is a writer, journalist, and public speaker whose writings have ranged from rock criticism to cultural analysis to creative exploration of esoteric mysticism. Uh, he's perhaps best known for his book Techgnosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, as well as his work on California counterculture, including Burning Man, the Human Potential Movement, and the writings of Philip K. Dick. Erik has also been involved in the editing of Philip K. Dick's The Exegesis, is the author of, I'm going to mention again, the Techgnosis, Nomad Codes, and his most recent book, High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experiences in the 1970s. High Weirdness explores the intersecting realities of Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson. Welcome, Davis.
Good to be here, Dan. Thanks so much.
Well, I think a good place to start is I was doing a little bit of work on your background, and you actually wrote your first thesis, right, on Philip K. Dick when you were as an undergrad.
Yeah, that's right. I was turned on to Dick's work in the summer of 1985, so shortly after he died, when he was not very well known at all. And I started reading his work, and I got very interested in Valis in particular. And I was also studying Gnosticism at the time. And so it all made sense to write my senior thesis in the English department at Yale. And it was called Philip K. Dick's Postmodern Gnosis, a very 1980s name. It was a lot of fun. I got an award for it, and I never turned it into, there was a couple parts that I probably could have turned into academic articles, and I didn't really do that at the time, but I did. Some of the ideas in High Weirdness, for better or worse, are ideas that I was already working out then and have, been kind of obsessed with for a long time. So yeah, Dick has been the most steady thread through all the different kinds of work that I've done. I did a lot of public talks about him, and I wrote articles about him in the early 1990s when, his fame was just now he's kind of canonized. And I was a fan when only fans were fans, and you couldn't find half the books. And then they started to be reissued in the 1990s, and there was kind of more of a sense of importance to his work. And I was part of that process. So writing articles for the Village Voice or a Spin magazine or Details. And so I was, and LA Weekly and stuff like that. So I was kind of part of the brigade that helped make Dick a bigger figure in American literature.
Now, I think if Phil was alive today, he would find this whole world we're living in, this pandemic, and very almost like a recreation of what perhaps may be coming from one of his novels or short stories.
I agree. I read him as a prophetic writer in some ways, and I think it's actually, I think it's good to do that. It's sort of against the grain. We don't really believe in prophecy anymore or religious prophecy, and so even when we read prophetic texts like the Book of Revelation at the end of the Bible, we unless we're religious believers, we read it, historically. This is something this guy wrote in the early part of the first century, and what were the political forces, and so we tend to not read things prophetically. And it doesn't mean to say that they're being that they're predicting the exact nature of the world. Obviously, there are other science fiction writers who are more invested in genuine predictions, technological predictions. But Dick, I think, is more special because what he actually is sort of prophesying is more of a mood or a vibe. I mean, there are a lot of nice little technologies, sometimes sort of thrown off, that he has that anticipate things that have come true. But it's almost more like the idea or the kind of symbolic force of these technologies that I think really tap into our feelings today. And I think the kind of I don't know what to call it, a sort of consumerist dystopia that we have now, with advertising impinging on us and marketing, and as our objects become more alive with technological interaction, we're more and more in, Joe Chip's Con app, where we're like, oh wait, we got to use the toaster, and the toaster wants me to give it $5, and where's my card? I can't. Oh, it's not working. I can't get out of the place. That sort of sense of like surrounded by all of these kind of insidious, pressuring technologies that don't work a lot of the time, or they're just a hassle. So anytime I'm like hassling with technology, or I start to go, wait, is this app actually tracking me, or is it recording everything, or like, oh, like this camera, what I bought, I just thought it was a camera, and I had these problems with sound a few times, and blah blah blah, and then I finally realized that it had a microphone on it. But when I bought it didn't say it had a microphone on it; it just was a camera. So all this time that I've been using the camera, I've also had this mic going, and so that sense of a kind of an ambient world that is alive with intelligence that's not really human, that's not necessarily in our favor, and that we have to navigate through all of that. I mean, that's just one example, but I do think it's actually good to read him that way, because you kind of get more out of it. And if anybody was going to be a prophet, not because he received the word of God from the heavens, but just because his imagination, his dream life was so rich and symptomatic of the world, that I think he's a good character to read that way.
I've always seen the way I like to take Phil is like almost, he's like the James Joyce of science fiction, in terms of some of this writing. Like Ubik, I had an experience when I read it the first time around. After like the 10th page, I started feeling vaguely dissociated from, and I realized that a lot of the writing is very much can be very much stream of consciousness, not just the standard, more analytic and scientific approaches, say, of Asimov or some of the other, or even Bradbury and so on. So a lot of people who come to me and say, hey, Dan, I'm not really crazy about Phil's writing. I say, well, you got to approach it this way, and then you start to appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I know that there's people do tend to have issues with a lot of the writing, and I think one of the ways to explain both the problems with the writing that some people have, and even I have problems with some of it, but also the stream of consciousness thing that you're talking about, and even the kind of dreamlike feeling it can give you, is we guys got to remember he wrote them really fast, and he didn't rewrite. So he would have notes for not towards the end. This kind of changed, but for like the work in the 60s, like the really visionary stuff in the 60s, Ubik, Three Stigmata, Martian Time Slip, he would like have like notes. He'd have a sense of where he was going or characters or something, and then he'd just sit down and just crank, and that was it. So he's writing in this, and some of them sometimes incredibly fast. Yes, he was on speed, but in a way it doesn't matter. I mean, the funny thing about speed, people say, oh, he's a speed freak, is that amphetamine is like the one psychoactive drug. There's a few others, but there's one of the major psychoactive drugs that's totally shown to actually improve cognitive capacity. Like speed really does make you think better and sharper and quicker. It's just that the cost of it is so high that it's not really worth it. But it's not that it turns you into a drug-addled person. It actually just gives you the energy to keep writing, and he needed to crank these out to make money. But I think it also created this sort of intense flow where there was a link between his conscious mind or his typewriting fingers and his unconscious. So it's more channeled in a weird way. And then once you read it like that, there's a heat to it that I think the sloppiness or the awkwardness that appears sometimes is totally redeemed by the intensity of the flow that's coming through.
Do you think that then a lot of his perhaps lack of interest in re-editing had to do with simply a time constraints or money, or simply because that was his style, which he...
Or both, it's like once you learn that you can get away with writing quickly and people seem to like it, he wasn't huge, but he wasn't tiny, he was modestly successful as a science fiction writer, for a lot of most of his life. At least he got published and he did get paid. So he had no interest in refining it. But at the same time, I think he was interested in, and there's a great variation in the quality of the writing in some of the books. So I think a book like The Man in the High Castle was clearly a book that he wrote as a kind of bid for the mainstream fame that he always really wanted. Like, he really wanted to be a literary mainstream writer who just kind of started writing science fiction and, didn't ever really got recognized during his life as a kind of literary writer. But something like The Man in the High Castle, he's definitely writing in a more literary way, and I think it shows. So that when you enter the surreal parts, he's very conscious of it, like with Tagomi's encounter with the jewel, the little jeweled object, and it's like it gets really trippy. But a lot of the other stuff is, it's pretty solid. So I think that he was aware almost of the hastiness of some of his writing, but it just worked out for him economically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that you picked in this book, High Weirdness, three of my own personal favorite writers. It's both Robert Anton Wilson, Terence Mckenna, Philip K. Dick, and they seem to, at least Robert Anton Wilson and Phil, knew each other.
Yeah, they did know each other. Dick was aware of the McKenna's writing, and certainly the McKennas were aware of him. They were science fiction fans, so there's a bit of a connection there as well. But yeah, Robert Wilson and Phil knew each other, casually, but they met and conversed, and both kind of appreciated the similarities and differences between their visions. So. I thought it was a good way. I've told the story before, but just briefly, the book this book is based on my PhD from Rice in religious studies, and I went in there and I was just going to write about the exegesis and 2374. That was all I was going to write about, and I had it all plotted out. I had worked on the exegesis. I'd read these books over and over again. I'd gone through all the letters. I had plenty of material to write just a monograph on Dick as a religious figure rather than as a literary figure who used literature and writing as a way to deal with his own extraordinary experience. And then at the very last moment, I was ready to go at all the lists and everything. I just went, this isn't quite right. I don't know if I want to spend my whole time just in Philip K. Dick's brain. And so then it became really clear very quickly that what I wanted to do was to compare him to these other 70s figures, also in California, who in different ways had these extraordinary experiences and used their writing, and in Terence's case, also his speaking, his lecturing, as a way to kind of work out the consequences of these experiences, which were sublime and visionary, but also kind of psychotic and paranoid, and what did they mean? And they raised a lot of issues. And so I ended up kind of like, sort of lining them up next to each other. I don't do a lot of super close comparison, but they all kind of resonate. And in the end, I think it makes a more interesting project. And one of the reasons was because the thing about Dick is that if you just focus on him, if you just focus on the exegesis and 2374 and Valis and, Radio Free Albemuth and all that, at the end of the day, no matter how much you say about it, it's still one pretty unusual guy, like a kind of kooky guy who whatever happened. He did whatever he did, but he kind of just sits over here. And part of the reason I wanted to write about the 1970s and write about these other writers was to say, look, Dick was in some ways, obviously he was singular, unique, nothing like him, nothing compares to him in science fiction or out. But in other ways, he was dealing with larger forces that were social, that were political, that had to do with the times and with the whole sense of the history and the future that was unfolding. So in a way, it was also a way to kind of weave him into a larger framework than we usually bring to him as critics or readers.
Many of the people, I found that a lot of people who read Phil are okay with the works from the 60s, maybe late 50s. But when it comes to 2374, here's this is a parting of ways. It's like, oh well, that's when Phil was going all mystical and religious on me, and I'm just more into the sci-fi. And I
Yeah.
see this dichotomy. I personally prefer the more mystical, but I do see that some people might associate the more the older Phil. However, in his writing, didn't he say that Valis was the culmination of all these things, all these thoughts he had over the years?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. And when those books first started coming out, when Valis, the late '70s, early '80s, Divine Invasion, whatever, a lot of science fiction critics, including critics that had devoted a lot of articles to celebrating his work, were like, he's lost the plot, he's
Right.
crazy, he's gone kooky. What is this stuff? It's new age crap, blah blah blah. And these days, I think that's not as true. I think most critics take the whole thing seriously, and in so doing, they don't see as much of a difference. And then in the end, that's kind of what I would say, is that while clearly something happened to him in 1974, something also happened to him in 1963. When he has the slot-eyed vision, and goes on to write the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. That was a visionary experience. It was not,
Oh,
it might have been drug induced, but
can you share that with us? Because this is actually the first time I heard.
oh yeah. So at this point he's living in Point Reyes, and he's writing in a little shack, and in some ways this part of his life is the most normal he ever got. He had a wife, and she had some kids. They had a nice house. He was making money because the Man in the High Castle did reasonably well. It came out hardcover, so things are looking pretty good. And then at some point, I think it's in the fall of '63, he goes to his cabin, and along the way he has a vision, or what he describes as a vision, of this figure in the sky who has the features that Palmer Eldritch doesn't have in his novel. He's got a metal hand, he's got metal teeth, he's got metal eyes. So he sees this kind of like metal god in the sky, and he knows that the god is evil. So it's sort of like a vision of what in Gnosticism you call the demiurge, which is like the lower god, the god of our prison planet, not the high god. And that's an interpretation. He didn't make that at the time. And so that's a very important vision, because not only did something like that happen, and that inspired his work and inspires Palmer Eldritch, which is probably my favorite book of there's a couple '60s books that I really like. It's also very prophetic. It's also very nightmarish, but it's also very spiritual. Like, it has a lot of stuff about it's kind of dealing with issues in Christianity and the Mass, but it's also dealing with the Tibetan Book of the Dead. There are certain parts of it where the kind of reality breaks that happen in it are mediated through these writings and images that come from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So it's a good example of how Phil was already a religious visionary at that point. And even in the 50s, he writes about religion a lot. He does it in a more sociological way, but he's always been interested in religion and religious figures and religious visions and how they fit into the picture. But the other interesting thing about the slot-eyed vision is that you can then see, and this is part of what my work on Dick is about, is how does he think about it later? How does he tell the story of what happened to him when he had his vision? And how does that change? And with the slot-eyed vision, it changes. Sometimes you go, oh, I had this vision and it was terrible. And I'm like, oh my God. And then later on he goes, well, I was not feeling very well. And, it probably has to do with my father. My father, he has this memory of his father putting on a gas mask when he's a kid. So a World War I gas mask, and he's hanging out with his dad, and I don't know the context, but he's young, and it terrifies him. So he has this memory. And so then he goes, so he's kind of like, doing some Freudian stuff like you would do in a therapist, well, I had this vision. It goes, well, what does it remind you of? Well, it reminds me of my father. And you're like, oh, yes, well, it must have to do with your father, so that the vision is not as important as this kind of family drama. And Dick kind of believes that too, sort of. But he also wants it to be like, yeah, but I did see something about the true nature of reality or the true force of evil in the world. And that's part of what interests me, is how Dick changes his stories about the visions that he has over time, and how we can learn what he's doing by looking at those changes.
It's almost like his own evolution is reflected in those stories. His own
Yeah,
conscious evolution.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, he was. Now you did. Tell us a little bit about the work you did in the exegesis in terms of.
Sure. Yeah, that was fun. No, it was really good. I I'd met Jonathan Lethem at some Phil Dick stuff, and Jonathan Lethem is well established literary writer. Kind of what Dick always wanted to be, who also
Right.
has fantastic elements in some of his novels, and is really quite has written a great deal of material. And one of the things that's interesting about Jonathan is that even once he became a well-known writer, he also was a fan. Like, he's willing to say, I'm a fan. Like, I love this stuff. And he was always a hardcore PKD fan. He did a lot to keep his name alive and to wrote about him. And I mean, he was an important figure that he kept wanting to sort of honor, and that I always really admire about Jonathan's enthusiasms, critical and aesthetic. Anyway, so I knew him, and they finally made this deal where all the work was going to get reissued. And so they decided, as part of that package, they were finally going to release the Exegesis, and which is an interesting thing, because in a way, for the estate, for the daughters at that time, they didn't really know what to do with the Exegesis, because it's just this immense, unwieldy pile of paper that's kind of crazy, sometimes totally crazy, like no argument about it. Psychotic, paranoid, repetitive, feverish, unhappy, whatever. I mean, really crazy stuff. But other parts pretty brilliant and metaphysical and philosophical. But they didn't really know what to do with it. And, in a way, it was kind of like an albatross. Like, what are we going to do with this stuff? And so finally, Jonathan Lethem, decided to kind of, actually, I'm trying to see if I can pull down my copy. If I think I got one around here somewhere. Hold on a second. I just love the way this book came out, as the hardcover with this thing, and like all that stuff, and you get to see like the images and all that bit. So anyway, Jonathan hooked up with an old friend of his named Pamela Jackson, who lived in Berkeley, and she had written her thesis on her PhD on Dick and the Valis experiences and the writings that came out of it. So he picked her to edit it. And they both edited it, but she really did the lion's share of the work. And I was basically her editorial assistant. So I helped her with some of her editing. And then I specifically was tasked with I went through some of the text myself, which is, I could talk about it for a while because it was a really interesting process. What do you choose? You have like a folder, there's like 90 odd folders, and some of them are thick and some of them are thin, and they're ordered in a weird way that doesn't correspond with the chronology. So it's a mess. And you have these huge handwritten things, and you're like, oh my God, and it's kind of the same thing, but you got to pull out like what's good, what would people want to read. So we had to go through some of that. A lot of people helped doing that process. And then also I wanted to pull out really precious jewels and get some other writers to comment on them. So I was sort of an editor for these annotations, and that was the main part that I did. So went through and contacted other science fiction critics and philosophers and other writers to just riff on certain sections to give the reader a little bit more of a way into what is a really formidable text. I mean, I can't believe to say this, that I've read this twice, but I have. But it's not. There's not going to be a lot of people like that. But there's a lot of jewels in there, and and that really, and it also really convinced me that, leaving aside science fiction, leaving aside his literary importance, just as a figure of American religious experience, Dick is one of the most interesting people in the 1970s, if not the post-war period. And so, from a religious history perspective, interested in Gnosticism, interested in the New Age, interested in visionary experience. What does it mean to have a religious experience? He's just incredibly fascinating. And because he worked out the consequences of that experience in this text, as well as his more polished fictions, it all helps show how he was reflecting and making meaning out of these crazy experiences that he had. So it was just such a juicy topic.
Yeah, I actually have Tessa Dick here on the chat room, and she mentioned that maybe, I guess this didn't happen, that the daughter should have asked the son for some feedback on that.
Yeah, I can't, I don't know the story about the what happened within the family, and I've never been in contact with Christopher and don't know very much about him. I know a little bit about some of the challenges he's faced and some of his life story, but I don't know about his role in the estate, and so I have nothing to say about that.
But I'm very glad that book came out, because it's only a fraction, right?
Oh yeah, maybe a tenth.
Okay.
So you imagine like 10 more of these, like.
That's amazing. They must be writing day and night to really accomplish that. Now, let's go back a little bit back to the 70s. It seemed that at that time, many of the contemporary of Dick were having similar connections or experiences. Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, John Lilly. Can you just give us a little background, a comment on that?
Yeah, so I think that if you want to say there was something similar going on, and they're never the same because everybody's singular, and I'm not saying there was one thing that was happening. It's not. There's a lot of divergence between these figures as well, but there were a number of really common characteristics. I think one of the main ones is that the experiences they had resembled traditional religious experience in a number of ways, but in other ways were not at all traditional. And they were not traditional because they drew from science fiction, from futurism and technology, from the counterculture and the sort of weirdness of all of the kind of countercultural metaphysics and all the strange ideas. And they all kind of traffic in a way with psychopathology. They're always kind of, some of the exegesis reads like a paranoid rant. Some of Robert Anton Wilson, part of what happened to him when he started having experiences of receiving messages from Sirius, and all these synchronicities start happening, and he starts weaving together this picture, and he feels like he's in contact with a kind of futuristic mind, and he's getting these dreams, and some of it involves science fiction and weird fiction that kind of comes alive, and all this not dissimilar kind of material. He also gets super paranoid. So that's actually kind of part of the problem, is when you take religious experience outside of the framework of religion, it gets wild. It's loose. It doesn't have a boundary. And so these guys are like pioneers. Like, let's take whatever religious experience is, whether you want to call it mysticism or ecstasy or visionary states or other altered states of consciousness. They happen and have happened to human beings throughout history. Extreme ones, powerful ones. They happen to people out of the blue. They happen to people who want them to happen. They happen to people who don't want them to happen. I mean, it's just part of our biology, is like we have like religious brains that make visionary experience happen. So I wanted to say, what happens when these things start going off in the 70s, which is such a strange period, a very important period in American history, and I think very important for our era now. I think in many ways our dystopia today is more like the 70s than it is like any other period. So they're also tapping into these larger, you might even think of them as the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. There are things that are happening with technology, things that are happening with altered states, things that are happening with the future, with even changes in commerce or in surveillance. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the 70s that these visions in some ways refract or project or focalize. So I really believe they were kind of like, swimming in the archetypal seas and then trying to ground themselves somehow and make a text or make meaning or tell a story that comes out of these really deep dives.
Yeah, it seemed like almost like it with these writers and some other writers afterwards, like Whitley Strieber, who talks about the visitors. It's almost like science fiction has become a new framework upon which to these visions emerge from.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot to say about the role that science fiction plays in both sustaining and mutating religious ideas, and not in a narrow way, but when I say religion, I'm including magic and astrology and
Right.
esotericism and the whole thing. And the UFO stuff is a perfect place to see that, where what happens with people, the way they talk about it. That there's clearly something going on that resonates with these more ancient traditions, and yet it has this distinct flavor that's contemporary, that's futuristic, that's weird. That's partly why my book is called High Weirdness, because the weird is a certain zone of experience and of literature that really speaks to the kinds of experiences that people have, where it's not like they're hanging out with God. They're like hanging out with weird little trolls and overalls with these weird,
Right.
Like, whoa, what's that going on? It's the weird. You can see that in weird fiction. You can see it in the history of these kinds of stories. So the weird as both a kind of literature and a kind of experience is something that's also going on with all of these figures.
One thing I do give all three of them credit for is that they didn't dogmatize it. They didn't turn it into a religion. They all retained this kind of skeptical take on their own experiences.
That's really important. I'm so glad you brought that up, Dan, because that's an important feature of what I'm calling this kind of post-religious religious experience, is that there's an element of skepticism. So and they all have it in different ways, they didn't exercise it perfectly. They all kind of like sort of bought their own story, at least in times, in different ways. But they were also all very involved with critical thinking, with thinking about things historically and metaphysically and philosophically. How would this work? And also being willing, and this is the key part, to distrust your own direct experience. A lot of the idea of religious experience, why people are interested in it, is because it's like, suddenly I know. I had a vision from God. It spoke to me directly. There was no mediation. There's nothing to doubt. I finally have something that's totally solid. And these were guys, partly because of the influence of psychedelics, not in Phil's case so much, although he did have some important psychedelic experiences. He didn't have very many of them. But the other guys were total heads. Right. Part of the experience of psychedelics is what it's like to go and have completely bizarre, otherworldly, metaphysical, the whole picture of reality experiences, and then you wake up the next day and you go, whoa, what was that about? So you start to have some skepticism even about your direct experience, and that's part of the reason that makes these guys so important, I think. They're not just fringe, marginal, countercultural weirdos. They're actually exploring what does it mean to have these extraordinary experiences, but bring to them a kind of historical awareness and also the sort of skepticism that you're talking about, where you don't get the answer. I mean, that's what the exegesis, that's the the end story of the exegesis is like, there's no final point. There's no place where you can land. And most traditional religions, it's the opposite. You land out of faith. Now I know. I know that Jesus died for my sins. I know that the gods are real. I know that, whatever the content of your vision is. And so they were working in this more complicated way that I think speaks to a lot more of us than if they had, gone in a sort of religious direction. I mean, they all had their little elements of it. Terence Mckenna definitely had a kind of cult around 2012 and these ideas, but he also played with it and was sometimes funny about it, sometimes made fun of himself. So they all had a little bit of guru in them, but they were totally unwilling to do the kind of normal thing that people do when they turn these experiences into a religion or a cult.
And they certainly had a sense of humor about them.
That's part of it. Indeed. Right. I didn't talk as much about this as I would have liked to, because I've thought about it more and more since. It's just how central humor is to people who are trying to navigate these realms and not get lost. And by getting lost, I mean they either like go crazy or become totally paranoid or believe your own story and become a cult figure or a guru. Well, how do you avoid that? You know, you can be skeptical, but you can also be funny. And being funny is kind of like a more a more life affirming kind of skepticism. It's not like I don't believe anything. It's all the Matrix. I don't believe it. You're like, well, what are we gonna do about that? And then you start. There's a liveliness and a life to humor that is very clear in Valis, because in some ways, Valis, particularly the first half of Valis, is a really depressing book. I mean, Phil is talking about these things that are based on his own experience. They're super heavy. It's like good people die for no reason.
Right.
And just looking at that, just there's no answer. You can't put wrap a bow around it. So it's some heavy stuff, but it's also funny, and that ability to have humor in the midst of difficult situations is not just an extraneous thing. It's absolutely central to the human spirit. And I think it's something about today. Today they're really heavy times, but everybody should be like cultivating humor, not as an escape or as a way to pretend that things aren't heavy, but actually as a way to stay upright and awake as you take on the consequences of these very difficult situations we're in. So I think they all have a kind of they all really appreciate humor as part of the thread.
In your book, which I actually have here for those Techgnosis, you mentioned data apocalypse, the concept of data apocalypse, and I can't help but think it's very relevant today with all these various rabbit holes that are opening up, YouTube, the alt disinfo channels, and so on, and people are falling down the rabbit holes, and sometimes they don't come out. That's the issue.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if we're talking about how these figures all look forward to our moment today, I think that's actually one of the most important ones, is the way in which we have mainstreamed these alternative worldviews, call them conspiracy theories if you want, alternate models. And because of the nature of our media, when these guys were writing in the 70s, there was still something like a mainstream media that was a pretty narrow channel, a couple of TV channels, some big newspapers of note that everybody took seriously. Everybody kind of believed. Walter Cronkite, the famous a news commentator. And there was also a kind of underground or hippie media, Rolling Stone, alternative papers. So there was an alternative news world, but it was pretty small. It kind of like went around here and went around there, and then there were people would self-publish things, but it was all very small. And now those distinctions have broken down, and there's no longer a mainstream. There's no longer a mass media. Everything is multiple. Everything is swimming. And simultaneously, that means you can be a very marginal person with a very peculiar view, and with a little bit of luck and some good YouTube editing skills and some, hooking up with some other marginal people out there, you can develop something, a rabbit hole that ends up being just as available to people on the mainstream. So everybody on the mainstream now knows about QAnon and Pizzagate and the moon landing wasn't real and flat earth, and we can go on and on and on about all these various rabbit holes, and not making a comment about what's true and what's not true, because in a way that's almost a lure. It gets you to not look at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is this thing I'm calling data apocalypse, which is like where there's so much data and there's so many streams of media, and there's no longer a model for how to navigate it, so that everybody's just kind of loose. And consensus reality, which is something that is, in many ways, I wouldn't say always, but in many ways, consensus reality is an artifact that we construct as a society through language and education and media and books and thoughts and symbols. That world of consensus reality is splintering.
Right.
So it's not just that it's like, oh, we're polarized politically. No, it's worse than that. It's that reality, as at least the part of reality that that relates to our symbol systems and our media and our ideas and our education, that kind of consistency around reality is just splintering and fragmenting and getting lost. And I am also concerned, as you are, about how many people get lost.
Yeah.
You know, I've been reading, about conspiracy theories since I read Robert Anton Wilson and Philip K. Dick as an undergraduate. So, 30 plus years of like being in this weird fringe world as a kind of anthropologist or 1 foot in, 1 foot out kind of guy. And so I'm used to people having super wacky ideas and being even sympathetic, wondering where are they coming from? Why did they come up to this point of view? Maybe there's something in it. What can I learn from it? But a lot of that's changed now, where it's much darker. It's very weaponized. It's being used by other forces behind the forces that you think you are getting. It's taking advantage of people's lack of education, their inability to think critically. But instead of just being like little, marginal weirdos who are collecting UFO paperbacks, they're massing together through the internet and kind of pulling like kind of taffy of consensus reality in these multiple directions. And I'm not saying that consensus reality is true with a capital T, but I am saying that a lot of the reasons that people get sucked into these worlds show that they weren't reading Robert Anton Wilson very carefully, or they weren't reading Philip K. Dick in a way where you're aware of like where he starts to lose the plot, and maybe that's not a road you want to go down. But at the same time, he's also showing you ways to be human and be seeking connection and be using humor as a way to reconnect with the world, even a very difficult world. And so it's like the wrong parts of these figures is being praised, the doubt, maybe we're just inside some kind of matrix, or maybe these aliens are coming down and planting symbols and all that kind of visionary science fiction imagination. That's the part people are looking at, but they're not looking at either the consequences of the dangers of this visionary path, and also the ways that all these authors suggest techniques for navigation, ways to move through a no longer coherent reality where you don't lose the plot and get sucked into some kind of reality tunnel where you can't escape, and then you just become an automaton of flat earth ideology, and you can't talk to anybody anymore, and you're just lost in a way. And they're like, no, don't get lost, keep thinking, keep critiquing, keep moving forward, keep opening up. You deal with, if you don't let the fears dominate you. You got to go through the fear to get to something else that has more to do with light and humor and human connection and clarity about the weird situation that we're in.
One of the things that is often understated is both in Robert Anton Wilson and McKenna, and all three of them is the concept of empathy as a key issue, understanding the other person. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of the narratives today. There is no real empathy, like in the, say, Blade Runner. How can you tell an automaton from a human? There's the empathy test, and that's something that perhaps more people should be aware of, as using that concept of almost like a hard consciousness or awareness about how we all still humans.
Yeah.
Before breaking it up.
Yeah, I totally agree in that, and it's not even as easy as just, well, no, we're actually just humans in the end of the day. It's that empathy is also a way to move through a world where we're not even really sure what the difference between human and technology is anymore. Like you meet people who are so technological, like they almost seem like they're already androids, but then they might actually do, really good things. And other people who seem like good old human beings, they're actually like racist monsters. And you're like, oh, we don't want anything to do with you. Oh my God. So it's a very confusing way. I mean, if you remember, like in Dick, it's the Ganymedean slime mold that is one of the most empathic characters. So for Dick, empathy is not about something that only humans have. Machines can have empathy. Weird aliens can have empathy. So that means that empathy is not just a humanistic character that keeps us within the human fold. Because people can be empathetic with the people on their tribe. And a lot of tribalism is actually, it's not just being cold and hating everybody else. It's genuinely loving and feeling value and empathy for your tribe. But if you do that in the wrong way, then you end up othering everybody else. And so even if you have a positive value of empathy for your tribe, all the other tribes are taken down. So we need a kind of empathy that's bigger than that, that's more alien, that's more strange, that lets us connect with other things, because we're all part of this now. It's not just a human problem now. We're all, the animals, nature, everybody's woven in, technology, it's all woven into this sort of apocalyptic moment. And I think empathy, especially in these guys' work, but especially Dick. I mean, Dick was really, he had or wanted that heart, and he saw the way that makes a difference, and that it's also tricky. In a way that someone like Robert Anton Wilson is a little bit more of a trickster. He's a little more of like playing with your mind and like not really like, and he's a good guy. Like he was a nice guy. He wasn't a jerk. He liked people. But I think for a kind of to really wrestle with this issue of empathy, it's still in PKD.
Do you, I don't know, Robert Anton Wilson uses the phrase "chapel perilous," which is part of the initiatory journey that a lot of people go. They go to this moment where they have all these four components have to be assembled properly. Otherwise, do you feel collectively there is that many people are in that chapel perilous, and hence they're either siding with reason or with emotion or what? It seems like collectively there seems to be a point where people are and how they're wrestling with the data and the confusion that maybe that's coming from all these various narratives is taking them to that point.
I think Wilson's idea of the chapel perilous, and also understanding its larger context within the Grail legend and within a certain kind of visionary Christianity, and I've seen it used multiple ways too. I mean, it's like all religious symbols have multiple meanings, and they can go in different directions. You can't rely on them entirely, but I think it's a very helpful way of demarcating a kind of space of ambiguity where you realize you can't go back anymore. It's like, I now know too much about whatever it is. I now have too many ideas along these lines. I can't just go back to some naivete, but I feel like I have no way of guiding myself through this. So what do I rely on? These problems of knowledge. And Wilson was famous, and he meant it in a kind of more particular way, in some ways, about paranoia, or like where it all fits together, and everything starts fitting together so well, like your dreams and the random things people say, and how it's all coming together into this big narrative, that you start to go, oh wait, I can't get back to just sort of normal skepticism. I either get lost in this and it consumes me, or I come out as what he calls a radical agnostic. And something about that agnosticism, which has to do with humor, which has to do with skepticism, which has to do with critical thinking, but also knowing that those things don't just bring you back to the rational world. It's like we've kind of lost tether to that old world. But if we don't maintain those qualities and keep connecting through empathy, as well as ideas, as well as the ways that humans gather together and really resonate, then you're more likely to get lost. And so we kind of want to be radical agnostics who still have to make decisions. And that's the key. You can't just sit there and go, oh, well, we don't know. Who knows? It's all a myth. It's all a narrative. It's all postmodern, but then you're just frozen. You can't do anything. So what do you act? How do you act? And there's no easy answer. I don't have an answer for that. But to be clearer about what the problem is, as opposed to just being sucked into it, seems really important for me right now.
Yeah. And so in the last latter years, how do you think Phil dealt with this download of information that came out from 2374? I mean, he wrote it, but what were his?
That's a really, I mean, I think in some ways it drove him crazy. I mean, not literally, but just it was a burden. he writes. There's a line in the Exegesis about it being a hell chore, and you do get the sense of a kind of hellish obsessional compulsion to try to find an answer to something that you can tell he's never going to get. So in a way, he was stuck in a kind of engine of speculation, of coming up with new ideas, and there was a trap to it. But as readers of Dick's work, we see the way that the same speculative obsession that drives the Exegesis, it's basically the same creative genius that gives us his books. Right. So in a way, there's something redemptive about his commitment to continue writing fiction as well as pursuing his own thinking in the Exegesis. So the greatest example is, the last published novel in his life, The Transmigration of Timothy Archer. So as he's writing the Exegesis, and in fact, in the last few years of his life, he kind of, even in a way, became more religious, where he has this messianic figure, Tagore, and then he's being more influenced by Benjamin Cream, and there's stuff in there that's even more like mystical, religious, messianic, apocalyptic, and some of it's kind of dark. Some of it's pretty, like visions of the judgment. God's going to return and judge the sinners, and he's got some strange threads in there. And so as he's doing that, like at night, he's like writing this stuff out, writing it out. He's writing this novel that, if you read the novel closely, is a very humanistic, secular, grounded, historical critique of the very kind of thinking that he's doing at night when he's writing his visionary manuscript. The Phil Dick character in Transmigration, as well as the Timothy Archer character, who's based on a real on a real person. In the novel, they're both like spewing these ideas all the time, speculative religious ideas, but you can tell that the moral center of the novel is with Angel Archer.
Right.
She's the moral center, and her world is really the world that Dick is both supporting and highlighting, but it's also a way for him to heal his own obsessions that he submits to at night. So he's like, it's like he's healing himself through these fictions that are critical of the excesses of the visionary imagination. And that's why it's just so rich. So I don't think it was easy for him, but it's not easy for most religious prophets. I mean, maybe some cheesy gurus get to, have a fun time along the way, but people, I think, who are genuinely driven by religious obsession and visions, or whether, in that broad sense of religion, I think they often have a tough time. And so, but my favorite thing about the end part of his life are the friendships that he develops in the late 70s, living, in Orange County. His friendships with Tim Powers and K.W. Jeters. And it's no accident that his fictionalizing of those friendships plays such an important role in Valis. So it might just seem like, oh, he's just hanging out with all these crazy guys, and they go see movies and they smoke pot and talk about crazy ideas. I mean, they don't literally smoke pot in the book too much, but you get the idea that it's kind of like a stone rant, like, whoa, what about this? What about that? And, and we know that like Jeter would bring him, hey, Phil, you got to read this crazy book about Renaissance esotericism. It's totally going to blow your mind. And he would even bait him like, wow, maybe your theory's like this, even though he didn't really believe it. So there's this whole game of like visionary thinking and skepticism and weird books and hanging out. But it's mediated through very human relationships. I think in a lot of ways, Dick's greatest friendships happened towards the end of his life. And so even if it was still a difficult life and he still had suicide attempts and he's still wrestling with his burdens, that there was also something very redemptive about his friendships.
Yeah, it seemed like that was a way for him and his writing to transform, to almost alchemize this
exactly
energy into something. And his choice of taking characters and within his works and having like the Phil, the writer, and Phil, and the other person is also Phil, like taking different, it's almost also similar to what Robert Anton Wilson is the reader will assume, or the intellect, the skeptic they almost take similar approaches. In case of Phil, it was more direct, I guess, and that more not as ironic, but more like, hey, this is what I'm doing. Um, where does that leave us in terms of Phil today? I mean, where do you? There are a lot of people have been theorizing. Again, this is part of the milieu that we're existing. Is say there, we're transitioning to another stage of consciousness, like Jean Gebza, the talked about it, and so where do you stand on this? And I think Phil talked about ultra metacognition,
Mm-hmm.
and how is that connected? I mean, in terms of stepping into a new framework of consciousness that will enable us to deal with all these different disparate narratives that are
Yeah,
taking.
one can only hope, Dan. I mean, it does seem like that's part of what's happening now, and it does feel like, despite all of the challenges that we're facing, that there is a kind of, I don't know, there's a growing sense of something about
Right.
our imagination, something about our consciousness, something about our awareness across the globe, something global going on, even.
Okay. Right. It seems like we're having some technical issues here. I'm not sure if people can hear me. Uh, Okay, we lost him. Hello. Oh, okay. Let me send you that invite again. I mean, you can. I guess you can still. Yeah, you can do. Go ahead and do that and reconnect. That's all you need to do. Okay. All right. I'm waiting over here. Okay. All right, people. I just got a call. It seems like on his end there was a little bit of a technical issue. However, he's reconnecting right now, so he should be with us momentarily. In the meantime, those who have joined us are more. I'll be asking him a couple of questions after he connects with us again. So if you're interested in knowing, having any questions answered, please write them in caps. I have already a couple of questions here for Erik, and we'll be good to go in a couple of seconds. So right now I'm waiting on him to reconnect and see here. All right. Any questions? Okay, right. You can hear me. Great. So he'll be okay. Oh, he's there. All right, Erik, we're back.
See, that's what happens. You start talking about the archons, and they gotta like shake their little tail, like, "Oh, you think we're not?"
This is true. Actually, I was watching recently a video webcast with Stephen Greer,
Uh
who is
huh.
the head of the Disclosure Project. And just when he was talking about something very similar, there was a shutdown.
Yeah,
So
I've had a number of those. There's definitely some gremlins out there. The whole idea of
definitely trickster.
gremlins are technological tricksters. That's where they come from. They're not
That's
based
right.
on ancient things. They're based on like aircraft in the Second World War. So gremlins are about. They're part of what we're playing with.
So
Here.
So, Erik, I got a couple of questions that people have asked. So I figure maybe you could, one of them asked, what do you think about Hanson Robotics and their robot? The Phil, I guess the Phil one is one of them is Phil of the robot.
Yeah, I got to meet Phil the robot, and I thought that was pretty entertaining. I mean, those guys they're good engineers, they're good marketers too, for sure. And I think that's one of the things about the world that we're in, is that the specific qualities of the technology, like how good is the AI, how good is the interaction. It's hard to assess those because they're inside these other narratives that have more to do with marketing and media and appearance. So while the whole losing the head of the robot and that whole crazy thing is just obviously that's like something that only Philip K. Dick would come up with in a narrative, and it's too good to be true. It's also the case that that whole question of like, is there a good PKD AI or not? Is it a good AI or not? And they came up with that. I can't remember her name, but the later robot that came out that became a Saudi Arabian citizen, and you're like, and
Sophia, yeah,
right, and so Sophia. So then you're like, oh my God, it's really happening. We're entering into this science fiction future. But then you kind of dig down more, and you talk to people who are, and I did this. I talked to people who are actually, who are, real roboticists or whatever. And they're like, yeah, it's not really that impressive technology. There's a lot more that people are doing. It's kind of more like a hype thing. Right. And I'm not saying that's totally the truth. I don't, whatever. It's a mix. But one of the weird things about our moment, particularly around science fiction, is that science fiction has given us the images and expectations that now technological development holds on to as a way to articulate itself to us. So it's like, these things are not what they would be without, a Star Trek communicator or whatever. Like we have these science fiction visions. Or another great example to talk about a PKD film are those wonderful 3D interfaces in Minority Report, where you're moving your hands through. Yeah, and those things they're building those things. And are they building them because it's an inevitable idea, or are they building them because we have these science fictions in our head? And it's kind of both. And the whole thing, it's the same thing with ufology. There's no way to look at the history of ufology without centrally looking at the history of films and fictions about UFOs. They're woven together, and part of the weirdness of our moment, and part of the weirdness that all three of these authors point to, and that I talk about a lot in High Weirdness, is how fictions are becoming real, and the real is shown as being somewhat fictional, and that's part of Chapel Perilous. Right. So that's part of the situation, that we find ourselves in.
Well, and I remember it kind of reminds me of Julian Jaynes' book on the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And one thing that struck me was in the very beginning when he says the metaphors that we use very much will determine our level of consciousness at that given moment. And now that science fiction and cinema are so prevalent, it's no accident that we're seeing all these cultural artifacts.
Exactly. Rooted. There are feedback loops, and there's many of them going off all at once. And I think all of these guys, they all give us a little handle on how those feedback loops operate.
I got here another question. Here is picked up a theme. This is from Sherry Fontaine. I picked up a theme that fills that movies were released with intention of conveying messages to the public. During his time, pre-internet, powerful people control the industry. Now that power has dissipated with tech advances. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's part of what we're talking about with the breakdown of the mass media. There were always ways that individual thinkers and writers could penetrate the mass, even in cinema or whatever, and have subversive messages or have messages that were against the mainstream or whatever. It was not. There is no monolithic control. Like even if conspiracy theories about control of media and Twilight language and all that stuff, even if they're suggesting something that is kind of true on some level, I don't believe it's monolithic. It's never monolithic. It's always sort of more like a chaos where some of the forces are these archons or controllers. And so I think one of the things that's happened now is that, yes, that's broken down, but it also creates an environment that's more that because of the traditional forms of authority have broken down and traditional filters have broken down, it also makes room for more madcap kinds of controls. So that, for example, if you go down and you go like, okay, where are these ideas about Bill Gates and the implanted chip and the vaccines? Like, how are they really working? What are they really a part of? And on the one hand, that's not the mainstream. It's definitely not being controlled by guys in Hollywood. On the other hand, it's very much part of larger political and ideological forces that people who are just staying on the level of the story get trapped by. So it also allows for other kinds of controls to enter in.
At the end of the day, I could say the quicker we develop our critical mind, the better it will be for all of us.
Yeah, I mean that's where, I mean, earlier you asked, when I got cut off, we were talking about like, global consciousness, and I'm not much of a like, oh yeah, we're on the lip of a big consciousness change, because I'm a historian and I know that people have been thinking that way forever. Like whether it's like, oh, the end of the world is going to happen next week, or in the 60s, like a great change is coming, or the 70s New Age, a change of global consciousness. And so there's this idea, and it just kind of keeps recurring. So I can't really say, oh, that looks like that's happening. But one thing that I do feel like I know is that we already have the elements. We know what our marching orders are. If we want to be part of this global change in consciousness, it doesn't mean going, the global change in consciousness is here, or it's going to happen next week. What it means is working on ourselves and our communities to develop critical thinking amidst this disinformation maelstrom of narrative control. Everyone's trying to control our dominant narratives. We have to become aware of how we control ourselves and are controlled by narratives. So we need that critical thinking. We need the ability to enter into non-rational realms, or realms of conspiracy, of realms of possibility, of realms of gods and demons, and keep upright, keep awake. We need to do that. And we need to develop what you were talking about earlier, real empathy, real heart, real connection to the sufferings that people are experiencing as part of this kind of global change. And so whether or not that leads to a breakthrough global consciousness, I don't know. But I do know that working in that way, earnestly, with conviction, doing it now, there's no time like now, because it's all coming apart. Working on yourself, meditation, reading, being aware of how meta narratives are working, trying to get that big perspective, but also being willing to take a risk on people, a risk on your heart, a risk on your intuition. That's how we become a cell in that larger transformation. And again, I feel these guys in that way are very important figures, because they kind of show us a little bit of what it's like to do that, while also showing us some of the dangers and traps you can get in.
And there certainly were, as Robert Anton Wilson, is one of the hardest things to find an intellectual who is not part of only the academic world, a real free thinking intellectual. Yeah,
that's true. That's been an interesting thing in my life, because I got, on one hand, I've had elite education. I had an undergraduate degree from Yale, but I didn't go into graduate school, and I became a freelance writer. And when I was a freelance writer, I was most drawn to people like Robert Anton Wilson, or my friend Peter Lamborn Wilson, who was another non-academic intellectual, historian, anarchist, poet guy. And these sort of non-academic figures were always more important and more interesting to me. And I do think that that's part of the work that we're in, is that while there are people working and using academic language that are important and worth paying attention to, that there's a kind of free thinking that is now required of us, that has to go beyond those confines.
And this is my last question, because I know we're there. This is from Tessa. Tessa.
Great.
She's asked,
hi, Tessa.
Yeah. Phil sometimes claimed to be Gnostic. Do you think he was a Gnostic?
That is a wonderful question, Tessa. I mean, we could do a whole other hour on that. So I need to say a couple of things about that. One is that within religious history, Gnosticism is a kind of squirrely term. Groups Some people use it to apply to a large number of groups, some people much smaller, and some people say it's such a vague term that we should throw it out. And one way of looking at Gnosticism is it's kind of a variation of Christianity. It has some non-Christian elements in it for sure, but it's kind of like an extreme variation. And so is it Christian or is it Gnostic? And Phil was very aware of that difference. There are parts in the Exegesis where he's very explicit. I'm a Christian. No, I'm a Gnostic. So he's drawing a distinction between them. And so what does that mean? And I think it's almost the degree to which he was more, how to say this, when he was more suspicious about the powers that be, when he was more aware of the darkness of the world and the darkness of the forces and individuals that control this world, and he was more Gnostic. But there was another side of him, I think, that was a little bit more expansive and loving of our reality here, with all of its faults, with all of its foibles. So the whole idea of the God in the gutter, it isn't just that we're stuck in a world of trash and the only way out is through this alien God who might sneak in a camouflage form. That's part of it. That's the Gnostic part. But there's another way in which we're just here. We're made of ashes. We're going back to ashes. We have a limited amount of time with people we love. And there's a kind of positive force in that. And in that way, I think he was more of a Christian. I think one of the interesting things about Dick is that nobody calls him a Christian writer. Right. Nobody thinks about him as a Christian writer. But so they'll say he's a Gnostic writer, but he's at least as much a Christian writer as he is as a Gnostic writer. Not in a narrow sense, not in a church-going sense, but in a way in which his heart was large in that mode, and he was very deeply inspired by that kind of mythos, as well as the kind of humanism and the kind of empathy that Christian approach suggests. I mean, he was interested in other religions. Taoism was important, and ancient Greek polytheism was important. I mean, he was such an eclectic thinker. You can't put him in any single category, including Gnostic. But I think Gnostic Christian, kind of a little bit of both, is probably the best way to see him. And just to make a final point about that, a lot of contemporary conspiracy theory is very, very Gnostic in a dark sense. What is it saying? That there are dark controllers, archons. Increasingly, people just even use the language of archons, which is a term used not just in Gnosticism, but also in Christianity. Paul in his letters talks about powers and principalities as being forces of darkness that rule parts of the world, and that's that same word, archon. So it's both a Christian and a Gnostic idea of these lower rulers. But inside a lot of these conspiracies, if you watch the stuff as someone who kind of likes these things, I'm like, wow, it's great, it's interesting. Oh, that's novel. Oh, that's kind of like clever or symbolically rich or whatever. But they're so absent of heart. They're so absent of any kind of humor or empathy or the possibility of they're so oppressed by their vision of the archons, and that's the trick. That's how the archons get you. It's not that by not knowing about them. It's like as you turn it, oh my God, we're ruled by these dark forces. We're ruled by horrible historical forces. Systematic racism exists inside of America at a fundamental level. How do we get out of this? Oh my God, it's so dark. Give up. Forget about it. There's no way out. All you can do is tear it down or go for Trump if you're crazy. But that's part of the problem. Is yes, we're in a very dark situation, but that is not an excuse to give up on these Christian values of love, of connection, of relationship with nature, relationship with history that's positive and flowing, and so that's I think a really key element that he was right on the edge of. He had very dark views sometimes, but there's still those threads running through it. And I think we're keeping those threads alive. And it's really important to do that, even as we, go deeper into Chapel Perilous.
Well, Erik, it's been an amazing chat.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dan.
I'm really happy that we finally had this chance to talk. As I said, I've had this book, and for those who haven't, there you go, Techgnosis. And I'm just going to let people know where to find you. Let me go here at. Okay, so the first website is Techgnosis.
Yeah,
Is
there's
that
tons of my writing there, like so much stuff. And also where I have an archive of most of the podcasts I did for Expanding Mind. And there's a lot of stuff in there. It's things that you would like if you like Philip K. Dick. So there's a lot of stuff there.
and can they get all of your books there at directly from
No,
there?
I mean I don't have a separate way of purchasing them. I think all my books are still in print right now,
Right.
and so that you can still get them in the conventional ways.
Okay, great. And then you also mentioned this other site, Erik Davis, this one.
Yeah, that's a news site I just started off. It's a newsletter called The Burning Shore, and it's also the place where I give my monthly roundup of podcasts I've done and events I'm going to do, and some brief reviews about things I've been reading and thinking about. But I've also been doing it as a new a project where I'm exploring, in a way, what almost all my work is kind of about, which is like what I call California consciousness. I'm a Californian. I see the world through this kind of weird California lens that all three of these high weirdness figures is part of the reason Dick is very important to me.
Right.
And so I'm kind of playing with that stuff in an experimental way. And Substack is a wonderful format because it's a way that allows writers and thinkers to create using mailing lists support. So it's kind of like a Patreon thing where you can subscribe for free, or you can subscribe and kick in $5 a month or whatever it is. But it's really helpful for people, independent writers and thinkers like me. There's a lot of people who do them. It's a wonderful platform. And again, you can totally get it for no charge. It's just that's also an option. So
Fantastic. And let me see there. I think that about covers it.
great.
So, Erik, again, thanks a lot. Maybe we'll do a part two down the road. Maybe
That's fun.
We've settled into this post-COVID reality.
Yes, I know. Whew.
And we'll let's see. Okay, great. Then thanks for everything. And,
yeah. Stay safe, Dan.
We'll stay in touch, and maybe one day we can meet live in California. In
Great.
One of our work seminars or workshops.
I hope so.
Stay safe. Stay well.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, people. There you have it. Another round of PKD Talks. For those who are interested, we definitely subscribe to our channel. That's our YouTube channel, because our goal down the line is to bring more people like Erik and others to the fore, discuss Philip K. Dick, and not only PKD, but also anything relating to the themes that he explores in his work. So please keep supporting us by liking and subscribing our channel, both on Facebook and on YouTube. And without any further ado, I hope you all stay well, and I will see you on the flip side. Bye-bye.